The first thing Isla Marlowe noticed about the man who would ruin and remake her life was that he never looked at the bride. She had planned 41 weddings across 3 continents, and she had learned to read a groom the way a doctor reads a pulse. There was always a moment while she walked a couple through seating charts or lighting cues when the man's eyes drifted to the woman he was about to marry, and something in his face went soft and stupid and human. It was the thing she loved most about her work. It was the thing that made the 80-hour weeks and the missed holidays and the empty side of her own bed worth it. Marco Devereaux's eyes never drifted. They sat in a glass-walled study on the top floor of a hotel that overlooked Lake Como, the water below beaten silver by an early spring wind, and he studied the timeline she'd printed as though it were a set of surgical instructions. He was younger than she'd expected from the way the hotel staff whispered his name. Mid-30s maybe, with the kind of stillness that made a room rearrange itself around him. Dark hair cut close, a jaw that hadn't smiled in a long time, a charcoal suit with no tie, the collar open at the throat, and beneath it, when he reached for the paper, the pale seam of an old scar riding up out of the fabric like a warning she couldn't read. "You said the ceremony begins at 6, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, an American accent sanded smooth by years abroad. "Walk me through it again, to the minute." "Of course." Isla slid closer to the paper. "Guests arrive by boat and car from 4:30. Champagne on the lower terrace. At 5:50 we move everyone to the lakeside altar. It's about 90 seconds from terrace to seats. 6 o'clock the processional. The vows run roughly 12 minutes. Then, the boat dock." He set one finger on the little illustrated pier at the edge of her map. "It stays empty." She blinked. "The bridal boat arrives at the dock. That's the entrance. The Toria comes across the water at sunset. It's the most beautiful. After she lands, it stays empty." He didn't raise his voice. He never, in all the days she knew him, raised his voice. No guests near the water, no staff, no boats tied up. From 6:15, on that dock is clear. Isla made a note. It was a strange request, but she had planned a wedding for a Saudi prince who wouldn't let anyone wear green, and a wedding for a tech billionaire who'd flown in a specific species of moth. Rich men had rules. You wrote them down, and you smiled. "And the band," Marco went on. "When do they break?" "They play through cocktails and dinner, then a 20-minute set change before dancing, usually around 9:15. 9:11, he said. "They break at 9:11, for 9 minutes. And when they stop, I want the terrace doors on the east side open and the security detail pulled back from the boathouse." She wrote 9:11 band break 9 minutes, and felt for the first time a small, cold finger touch the base of her spine. Not fear, not yet. Just the faint wrongness of a number too specific to be about music. "May I ask why 9/11? She said lightly. "Because charm was her armor, and she wore it well. Most of my couples pick times that mean something. Anniversaries, first dates." For 1/2 of 1 second, Marco Devereaux looked at her. Really looked the way you'd look at a lock you weren't sure you could pick. "It means something," he said, and looked back down at the paper. She should have walked away then. She told herself that later 100 times in the dark. She should have felt the wrongness and packed her tablet and flown home to Chicago, where the worst thing a client ever did was cry over the wrong shade of peonies. But there was no budget. Marco Devereaux had said the words every planner dreams and dreads. No budget, no questions. And he'd said them the way other men said, "Pass the salt." The commission on a wedding like this could buy her the studio she'd been renting on borrowed money for 6 years. It could make her name. And there was something else. Something she was too proud to admit even to herself. The way the air changed when he entered a room. The way her own carefully managed life suddenly felt beige beside the black and silver danger of his. So she stayed. She moved into a suite at the villa, and she began day by day to build the most beautiful wedding of her career, never knowing she was drawing a map of how 30 people would die. The villa was called Serenella, and it sat on a private finger of shoreline where the mountains fell straight into the lake. Cypress trees stood along the drive like dark sentinels. The gardens dropped in stone terraces to the water, and everywhere Isla walked, she found men who did not garden, standing in the gardens, men who did not serve standing near the doors, watching the tree line and the water and her. She met the bride on the 3rd day. Vittoria Castellano was without question the most beautiful woman Isla had ever seen, and the most silent. She came down the grand staircase flanked by 2 women who never left her, a pale, slender girl of maybe 22, with heavy dark hair and enormous eyes that seemed to be looking at something just past the edge of every room. When Isla offered her hand and her warmest smile and said, "I'm Isla, I'm so honored to help make your day perfect," Vittoria looked at the offered hand as if she'd forgotten what hands were for. "She doesn't speak much English," said one of the women quickly. Too quickly. "That's all right," Isla said. "Weddings are mostly feelings anyway. We'll manage." But as she turned to lead them toward the fabric samples, she caught at the flicker of Vittoria's eyes toward the window, toward the water, and then toward the door, cataloging exits the exact way a trapped animal does. And Isla, who read people through the things they couldn't hide, felt that cold finger touch her spine again, and this time it pressed harder. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stood at her window in the enormous dark of the villa and watched a single light burning far out on the water, a boat that didn't move, and she thought, no bride is that afraid of her own wedding. Then a knock came at her door soft, and she opened it to find Marco Devereaux standing in the corridor in the low amber light, holding 2 glasses and a bottle of something old and Italian, and every rational cell in her body told her to say goodnight and close the door. "You were watching the lake," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen her at her window. He saw everything. "I couldn't sleep, neither can I." He didn't step forward. He never crowded her. That was the thing that undid her in the end. A man that dangerous who never once used his size against her. "Walk with me. There's something you should see if you're going to light this place properly." She should have said no. She got her coat. He led her down through the terraced gardens to the water's edge, and the night was enormous and cold, and full of stars, the mountains black against a blacker sky, the lake breathing quietly against the stones. He didn't touch her. He walked half a step behind, and she understood without being told that it was so he could see anything that came at them from the front. "My brother loved it here," he said out of nothing. "Tomas. He used to say the lake was the only honest thing our family ever owned. Everything else we took, the water we just borrowed." "Used to," she said gently. A muscle moved in his jaw. "He died 14 months ago, here, on this shore." The wind moved through the cypress. Isla stood very still. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, and he heard that she meant it, and something in the granite of his face shifted by a millimeter. "Everyone tells me the wedding is a beautiful idea," he said. "A union, a new beginning." He looked out at the single light still burning on the water. "Do you believe in beautiful ideas, Miss Marlowe?" "I make my living on them." "That's not the same as believing." He turned and the starlight caught his eyes, and for a moment the mask was simply gone, and she saw what was underneath. Not softness, nothing so easy, but a grief so old and so contained, it had turned to something harder than grief. Purpose. "Light the altar warm," he said. "Gold, not white. When it happens, I want the last thing this place remembers to be beautiful. When it happens, not when we marry." She noticed the words. She filed them away, and she told herself she was tired and had misheard. He walked her back to her door and stopped at the threshold, and there was a moment she would replay it 1,000 times, when his hand rose halfway toward her face, toward a strand of hair the wind had pulled loose, and stopped. Just stopped hovering in the cold air between them, his eyes on her mouth, his whole terrible stillness, trembling at the very edge of something. Then he let his hand fall. "Good night, Isla," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. It landed low in her stomach like a stone dropped in a well. "Good night, Mr. Devereaux." "Marco." And he was gone, down the amber corridor before she could answer, and she stood with her back against her closed door, and her heart going like a trapped bird, and thought with the clear, cold horror of a woman who has just realized she is standing on a frozen lake in April. "I am in so much trouble." The wrongness accumulated the way water fills a boat so slowly you don't notice you're sinking until your feet are wet. Marco kept refining the plan, and none of the refinements were about romance. He wanted the dinner tables arranged so that every seat had an exit within 12 feet. He wanted the fireworks a gorgeous idea she'd thought sunset fireworks over the lake, timed to a precise sequence. The loudest shells at 9:13, and when she said the barge could launch them a little later for better dark, he said 9:13 in a voice that closed the subject. He wanted the caterers gone by 9. He wanted a specific black SUV parked at a specific angle by the boathouse, engine warm. He wanted to know how loud the band was in decibels at the moment they stopped. Isla filed it all under demanding client perfectionism, the way you file a lump under probably nothing, because the alternative is unthinkable. But at night, alone with her tablet, she found herself doing something she'd never done in her life. She stopped looking at her timeline as a wedding. She looked at it as a machine. And when she did, the machine was beautiful, and it was terrible. The empty dock and escape route by water. The exits at every table, a way for certain people to leave fast while others couldn't. The fireworks at 9:13, cover for noise. The band break at 9:11, 9 minutes of quiet before the sky exploded. The security pulled back from the boathouse. The SUV engine warm. 9 minutes. 9:11 to 9:20. A window. A window for what? She sat in the dark with her heart in her throat and told herself she was a wedding planner with an overactive imagination and a dangerous crush, and she almost believed it. Until the afternoon she went looking for Vittoria to fit the veil and opened the wrong door in the east wing and found the bride sitting on the floor of a locked room, wrists raw where something had held them, weeping without a single sound, and two men standing over her who turned on Isla with the flat, empty eyes of men deciding whether to let something live. You saw nothing. Rocco Vitali had a soft, round face and a soft, round voice and eyes like two chips of river ice. He was Marco's oldest friend, his consigliere, and he'd caught Isla by the elbow in the corridor before she'd made it 10 steps from that terrible room. The girl is unwell, nervous. It happens before a wedding. You understand. Her wrists. You saw nothing, Miss Marlowe. His fingers tightened. You are a guest in a house you do not understand. Do your job. Make it pretty. Fly home rich. That is the whole of your part in this. Do you follow me? She followed him. She followed him all the way to the marrow of her spine. But she was Isla Marlowe, who had built a business from nothing, with 2 hands and a stubbornness her ex-fiancé had called impossible right before he left, and being frightened had never once in her life stopped her from needing to know the truth. That night she went to Marco. She found him on the lower terrace, alone, a glass of untouched wine beside him, the lake black and enormous below. He knew she was there before she spoke. She felt him know. That girl is a prisoner, Isla said. Her voice shook, and she let it. There are ropes marks on her wrists. She's terrified of you. She's terrified of this house. And your timeline isn't a wedding, Marco. I've been staring at it for a week, and I finally let myself see it. The dock, the exits, the fireworks, the 9 minutes. I don't know what you're planning, but it is not a marriage. So you're going to tell me, right now, or I am walking to the village and finding a phone. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind moved. Far out on the water, the single light burned. Then Marco Devereaux did the thing that broke her heart and welded her to him in the same instant he told her the truth. 14 months ago, he said, quiet, and even still looking at the lake, Salvatore Castellano invited my brother to a peace talk, on this shore. Tomas went because I told him to, because I believed in beautiful ideas. His hands were very still on the stone rail. They shot him 11 times and left him in the water and sent me his watch in a box with a note that said, "Learn your place." He was 26. He wanted to leave the life. I'd promised him he could, once we had peace. Isla's hand had risen to her mouth. There is no such thing as peace with the Castellanos, Marco went on. There is only the moment before they decide to kill you. So when they offered a marriage, a truce sealed by Salvatore's own daughter, I said yes, and I began to plan. He turned to her at last, and his eyes in the dark were the eyes of the man on the shore, who had turned grief into something harder. Every Castellano who matters will be at that altar on Saturday. Salvatore, his brothers, his captains, all of them in one place, unarmed by tradition, watching the water at sunset. They will never be gathered like that again in my lifetime. And at 9:11, when the band stops and the fireworks are about to start, and my brother's murderers are drunk and laughing at my wedding. You're going to kill them, Isla whispered. All of them. During the wedding I built. During the wedding you built, he agreed. There was no cruelty in it. There was only the terrible arithmetic of a man who had done the math 1,000 times. You built it perfectly. You built me 9 minutes. She stepped back from him. The stone rail caught her. And Vittoria, the bride, you're the girl in that room. Something crossed his face then, and it was the first thing she'd seen on it that looked like shame. Salvatore murdered her mother when she was 14 for the crime of wanting to take Vittoria and leave him. She is not my bride, Isla. She is not a bride at all. She is bait, and she is a prisoner of her own family's honor. And the day I bring the Castellanos down is the day she is free of them forever. She knows what Saturday is. She has counted the minutes longer than I have." He paused. "The ropes were not mine. Her own uncle put them on her when he caught her trying to swim to the village to warn no one, because there is no one in her whole life she can warn." Isla stood in the enormous dark, between a truth she could not carry and a man she should have been running from, and she understood with the falling sensation of the frozen lake finally giving way that she was not going to run. "You used me," she said. "Yes. You made me an accomplice to a massacre, and you didn't even—" "I know." And then so low she almost lost it under the wind. "And it is the only thing in 14 months I have wanted to undo. Not the plan. You." He took one step toward her, and stopped the way he always stopped, his hand rising and freezing in the cold air between them. "The day I met you, I decided you would leave here Thursday before any of it. A commission, a signature, a plane. Nowhere near the blood. I have spent every night since trying to make myself send you away, and I cannot do it. And that is a weakness I have never had, and it is going to get one of us killed." His voice cracked on the last word just barely, just once, and it was the most violent thing she had ever heard. "Go home, Isla, Thursday. I will pay you triple. I will forget your name. Go home and be alive." She looked at his hand hanging in the air between them, trembling. She took it. She didn't decide to. Her body decided for her, the way it had gotten her coat that first night. She closed her small, warm hand around his scarred one and held it, and she felt the shock go through him like a current felt the whole granite mass of him go still with something that wasn't fear, but was fear's cousin, the terror of a man who has just been handed the one thing he can be made to lose. "I'm not leaving that girl in a locked room," Isla said, steadier now because being needed had always made her brave. "And I'm not leaving you to do this alone, God help me. But you're not doing it this way. You are not turning my wedding into a grave. There has to be a way to free her and end them that doesn't paint this whole lake in blood. And if there's anyone alive who can plan 9 perfect minutes down to the second, Marco, it's the woman who already did." For a long, long moment, the Mafia boss who frightened grown men into silence stared at the wedding planner holding his hand, and something moved behind his eyes that no one in his world had seen in 14 months. It looked terribly like hope. They did not sleep that night, and not in the way a lesser story would have it. They sat on the floor of her suite, with the timeline spread between them, and they took the machine apart and built a better one. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, she realized she was laughing at something he'd said, and he was almost smiling. And the horror of what they were planning and the impossibility of what was blooming between them existed at once, inseparable, the danger and the wanting, braided into a single, unbearable thing. He told her about Tomas, the real Tomas, who collected terrible American pop songs and couldn't swim, and was afraid of the lake he loved. She told him about the fiancé who'd left, and about the studio she'd built from nothing, and about how she'd never once, in 32 years, let herself need a single person, and how that had felt like strength until precisely this moment. At dawn he stood to leave, and at the door he stopped, and this time, when his hand rose toward her face, it did not freeze. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, as if he were memorizing it against a day he'd have to live without it, and he leaned in until his forehead touched hers, and they stood like that, breathing the same air, not kissing on the edge of everything. "If you die because of me," he said against her skin, "there is not enough of the world I could burn to make it right." "Then don't let me die," she whispered. He kissed her forehead, once, softly, a benediction, and left before it could become the thing they both wanted, because there were 2 days left, and a plan to change, and a bride to free. And Marco Devereaux had learned young that the moment you let yourself have the thing you love is the moment the world takes it away. He was right to be afraid. He just feared the wrong day. Because Rocco Vitali had been watching too. The consigliere had spent an hour outside Isla's door that night, and he had seen the hope on Marco's face when he left it. And Rocco, soft-voiced, soft-faced Rocco, who had held Tomas's body on this shore 14 months ago and wept real tears, had known then that his patience had finally run out of road. Because Rocco was the one who had told Salvatore Castellano where Tomas would be that night on the shore. Rocco had sold his best friend's brother for a territory and a promise, and he had spent 14 months standing at Marco's right hand, helping him plan a revenge Rocco intended to make sure failed, a revenge that would gather Marco and all his loyal men in one place, at one altar, in one 9-minute window, so that Salvatore's real ambush could take them instead. 2 traps in the same wedding, laid over each other like a double exposure. And now, the woman, the planner, the variable no one had accounted for, changing the timeline, changing Marco, making him hope, making him, worst of all, someone who might at the last second choose to live. Rocco could not allow that. So, the morning of the wedding, while the villa filled with flowers, and the fabric of the altar snapped gold in the wind, Rocco Vitale made 2 phone calls. One to move Salvatore's ambush up 9 minutes from the band break to the ceremony itself, 6 o'clock. The vows when everyone would be seated and watching the water, and no one would be looking at the boathouse. And one to a man he kept for exactly this, with a single instruction about the American woman. When it starts, she doesn't leave the shore. Isla knew something was wrong at 5:52. She knew it the way she'd learned to know everything through the logistics. She stood at the top of the terraced garden with her tablet and her earpiece and her clipboard in a slate blue dress, because even now, even planning this, she would not show up looking like anything but the best in the world at what she did. And she watched 200 beautiful, terrible people take their gold-lit seats by the water, and she felt the machine running. But the machine was running wrong. The Castellano security by the boathouse hadn't pulled back, they'd pulled in tightening wrong hours early. The East Terrace doors that should stay closed until 9 were standing open now. And Rocco was not where the new plan put him, at Marco's shoulder near the altar. Rocco was at the top of the garden, near the cars, near the exits, checking his watch. And he was checking it the way you check a watch you're counting down. Isla's blood went to ice. She keyed her earpiece, the one channel she and Marco shared, the private one. Marco. She kept her voice level, a planner soothing a nervous groom in case anyone was listening. The lighting on the altar. Come check it, now, before the processional. It's important. A pause, then his voice low, understanding everything from the wrongness of the request. What do you see? Everyone's early, she breathed, turning her back to the crowd, her lips barely moving. Their people didn't pull back, they closed in. The east doors are open, and Rocco's by the cars, watching a clock. Marco, it's not 9:11, it's now. Somebody moved it to now. It's a trap, and it's yours. Silence on the line. Below her, at the gold altar by the black water, she saw Marco Devereaux go absolutely still in his white shirt, and she saw him understand in a single second the thing that had been done to him, that his revenge had always been someone else's ambush. That the man beside him for 14 months had been the hand in the box with his brother's watch, that the learn your place had come from inside his own house. She saw him turn his head very slowly and find Rocco at the top of the garden. And she saw Rocco look back down the length of the wedding at his oldest friend and lift his watch and smile. Isla, Marco said into her ear, and his voice was the calmest she had ever heard it, which was how she knew. Run. The world came apart at 5:54. The first shot took the string quartet's cellist, and the beautiful gold-lit lakeside dissolved into screaming, and the flat, obscene cracks of gunfire, and the churn of 200 people trying to occupy the same 9 feet of terrace at once. Salvatore Castellano's men rose from among the caterers, and the boatmen, and the guests themselves, guns coming up, and Marco's loyal men, the ones Rocco had gathered here to die, rose to meet them. And the wedding Isla Marlowe had built to be the last beautiful thing this place remembered became a slaughter in the space of a single breath. And Isla ran the wrong way. She ran down into it, toward the altar, toward Marco. Because Vittoria was down there, she'd glimpsed her at the boat, pale and silent in white, exactly where the plan had put her, exactly where she'd be, a body in 90 seconds. And Isla Marlowe had said, "I'm not leaving that girl," and she had meant it with everything she was. She got 20 feet before Rocco's man caught her. He came out of the garden with a hand like iron, and a knife she saw too late. And he was so much stronger than her that the unfairness of it was almost funny. And she thought with strange clarity, this is how it ends, on a beautiful shore, planning a wedding that was always a grave. And then the man's head snapped sideways, and he dropped, and Marco was there. Marco was there with blood already across his white shirt that wasn't his, and a gun in his hand, and murder in his face. And he put himself between Isla and the entire disintegrating world, one arm sweeping her behind him, and he fired past her at something she didn't turn to see, and the noise of it was the loudest thing she'd ever heard, and she felt it in her teeth. "The dock," he said, not looking at her, his back a wall, walking her backward down the terrace, one impossible step at a time, while the air came apart around them. "The empty dock, Isla, the boat, engines warm, go. Vittoria." I'll bring her. Go." She went. She would hate herself for it, and she would understand it forever. She went down the terraced garden, through the smoke and the falling and the screaming, and behind her she could feel him covering her every step, this man who feared nothing except her death, turning her wedding into her escape. And she reached the dock, the empty dock, the dock he'd made her keep clear from the very first day, the one strange rule that made no sense, that had never been about the boat's beautiful entrance at all, but about this, about a way off this shore for the one person he'd decided to save. And she understood that Marco Devereaux had been protecting her since before he'd admitted to himself he wanted to. She turned to look back for him, and she saw two things at once. She saw Marco reach the boat, half carrying a bleeding Vittoria, shoving the girl down into Isla's arms. And she saw at the top of the garden, Rocco Vitali raise a gun and aim it at Marco's back. "Marco!" He turned into it. There wasn't time to do anything else. He turned, and the shot took him high in the shoulder and spun him, and he went down onto the dock, and the second shot would have finished him, except that Vittoria Castellano, silent, ghost-pale 22-year-old Vittoria, came up out of the boat with the dead man's fallen gun, that Isla hadn't even seen her take, and fired 4 times up the length of the garden, with the steadiness of a girl who had imagined this exact moment 10,000 nights in a locked room. And Rocco Vitale, who had sold his best friend's brother on this shore, fell dead onto the stones, 8 feet from where Tomas had died. Vittoria lowered the gun. She looked at Isla, and for the first time since Isla had met her, the girl spoke in perfect, quiet English. The English she'd hidden for a week, her voice like something surfacing after a long time underwater. "He's alive," she said. "Get him in the boat. I'll cover the dock. Nobody comes down the empty dock." He made sure of that. Something that was almost a smile crossed her ruined, beautiful face. He always made sure. The boat carried 3 people across the black water of Lake Como, as the villa burned gold behind them. Marco lay with his head in Isla's lap, and his blood soaking through her slate-blue dress, and she pressed her hands to his shoulder with a strength she didn't know she had, and told him fiercely that he was not allowed to die, that she had not built the most beautiful wedding of her career and turned it into a getaway, and fallen in love with a monster, only to have him bleed out in a boat. And Marco, pale, fading, absurd, huffed something that might have been a laugh. "You said monster," he murmured. "I know what you are. Do you?" His eyes found hers in the dark, the mountains black around them, the fire on the shore turning the whole lake the color of a wound. "I hired you to plan my revenge, Isla. I was going to use you and pay you and never think of you again. I know. I built the empty dock the first day, before I trusted you, before I knew you." His hand rose shaking and found her face, smearing it with his own blood, and she didn't flinch. "I told myself it was operational, a contingency, an exit." His breath rattled. "It was for you. I built a way to save your life before I let myself know I couldn't survive losing it. That is what I am, Isla. I'm a man who protected you before he'd admit he loved you. There isn't anything softer under it. There's just you. There's just you all the way down." The lights of the far village were coming up out of the dark, and a Dr. Marco owned was waiting there. And he would live. She made him live. She and Vittoria dragging him, bleeding up a stone quay under the stars. She, refusing to let go of his hand, even while they cut the shirt off him. Refusing to leave the room. Refusing, for the first time in her whole self-sufficient life, to be anywhere but exactly where she was most afraid to be. Behind them, Salvatore Castellano's empire died on a burning lakeshore, undone by a betrayal that had rebounded on its own author, by a daughter he'd caged too long, and by a wedding planner from Chicago who could read a man through the logistics he couldn't hide. The Castellanos never rose again. Neither did the life Marco had been born into, because a man who has finally let himself want to live wants more than anything to stop. They found her in the end, on the shore of a different lake. It was almost a year later in the north of Italy, at a small house with no guards in the gardens because there was nothing left to guard against, and Isla Marlowe stood at the water's edge in the gold evening light and watched a man who no longer flinched at open doors walk down toward her with a slight favor in his left shoulder that would never quite heal and never quite matter. Vittoria was there too that summer, free loud now, that she'd remembered how studying at a university 2 hours away and calling Isla twice a week to argue about nothing, the little sister neither of them had had. The scar on her wrist had faded to almost nothing. She was learning to swim. Marco reached Isla at the water and did not stop his hand halfway anymore. He never stopped it halfway anymore. He touched her face, and she leaned into it, and behind them the lake breathed against the stones, the only honest thing his family had ever owned. "You know what today is?" he said. Not a question. He still saw everything. "A year," she said. "A year." He turned her hand over in his, and pressed something small and cool into her palm. And when she opened it, it was not a ring, it was a watch. Old, plain, a man's watch. The one thing Salvatore Castellano had sent back in a box with a cruelty meant to break him. Tomas's watch. The thing that had started it all. "I don't want revenge anymore," Marco said quietly. "I got the only thing revenge was ever standing in front of. I want a wedding, Isla. A real one. The most beautiful thing this place ever remembers. And I want the only person alive who could possibly plan it, to plan it for herself." His voice, that low, unhurried voice, that had frightened grown men into silence, cracked one last time for her, only ever for her. "Marry me. Keep the dock clear if you want. But this time, when the band stops, let it just be so people can dance." And Isla Marlowe, who had planned 41 weddings for other people, and never once let herself imagine one of her own, who had walked down into gunfire because she would not leave a girl in a locked room, who had read the truth of a dangerous man in the minutes of a timeline, and chosen him anyway. Isla laughed, and it was wet and ruined, and the happiest sound she'd ever made. And she closed her hand around the watch, and pressed her forehead to his, the way he'd once pressed his to hers, on the edge of everything. 9 minutes, she whispered. "Give me 9 minutes and I'll build you a wedding they talk about for 100 years. Take the rest of your life," Marco Devereaux said. And the sun went down gold over the water. And this time, the only time that had ever mattered, it was just a wedding, and just a shore, and just two people who had walked out of the fire, holding a hand they'd both been too afraid to reach for, and had learned at last that the bravest thing either of them would ever do was simply refuse to let go.